On a dying stretch of desert at sundown, a broke cowboy named Jonas Hale walked alone with nothing but his water barrel and the one horse keeping him alive. He had no family, no ranch left, and no reason to trust anyone. But then he found her. An Apache woman collapsed in the sand, bleeding, whispering only 2 words. "They're coming." Helping her meant giving up the only horse he owned. Helping her meant walking 30 miles home on foot. But Jonas didn't hesitate. He put the reins in her shaking hand. What he didn't know was that by sunrise, 70 Apache warriors would ride straight toward his shack. And the choice he made in that moment would change the future of 2 nations. Forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The last light of day bled across the desert when Jonas Hale spotted something slumped beside his traveling barrel, a dark shape half swallowed by drifting sand. As he drew closer, the wind carried a thin, broken whisper, and he found an Apache woman sprawled against the wood, her breath shallow, her skin burning with fever. She reached for him, but her hand stopped short of the canteen at his belt. Instead, her gaze fixed on his horse, trembling with desperation as she rasped, "Not water. The horse. Please. They're coming." Jonas stiffened. That mare was more than a mount. She was his only way home, the difference between surviving the long miles and dying nameless under the desert sky. Every instinct told him to protect her, to guard what little he had left. But as he knelt and saw the blood soaking her side, something heavier than fear settled on him. He eased water to her lips, lifted her head gently, then pressed the reins into her hand before she went limp, unconscious before she knew he had chosen mercy over sense. His mare bolted into the gathering dusk with her small weight slumped over the saddle, vanishing toward the far ridge where the sun had already died. Jonas stood alone beside the barrel, listening to the widening quiet, the kind that told a man the world was shifting around him. Somewhere out there, someone, or many someones, were hunting her, and as the desert darkened, Jonas couldn't shake the question of who might reach him when dawn finally came. Jonas reached the lion's shack just as the sky bruised into full dark, the woman's limp weight growing heavier with each uneven step. Inside, dust coated the plank floor, and the air smelled of old timber and mouse nests, but it offered shelter, and tonight that was enough. He laid her on his bedroll, lit a stub of candle, and pulled back the torn fabric at her side. The wound was deep, a knife strike angled with intent, not accident. As he cleaned it with the last of his boiled water, she stared, her voice a cracked thread whispering words he could barely catch. "Betrayed, one of our own, took what wasn't his." Her fingers tightened suddenly around something on her chest, and Jonas leaned closer, seeing a small woven pendant shaped like a sunburst. He recognized the pattern from trail tales, mark of a Gila clan known for mending both bone and feud. It made the wound on her side feel heavier, as though someone had tried to silence a voice meant to help. Outside, coyotes circled, their yips sharpening into cries as moonlight washed the desert. Jonas glanced toward the door each time a shadow shifted, torn between fear and duty. He had no horse now, no easy path back to town, and no guarantee that whoever hunted her wouldn't hunt him next. Loyalty to oneself whispered that he should leave her and flee on foot before dawn painted him an easy target. But another voice, quieter, older, reminded him that he'd handed over his horse because something in her plea had struck true. He couldn't abandon that choice now. So he stayed, feeding the fire, pressing cloth to her wound when fever rattled her, and listening as she muttered fragments about stolen goods, a broken oath, and a name swallowed by pain. Hours stretched thin. Jonas sat with his back to the cold wall, rifle across his knees, trying not to imagine what kind of betrayal drove a healer into the desert to die. Just before dawn, when the air held its breath, he stepped outside for a lungful of cooler air and froze. Fire crossed the ridgeline, flickering like fireflies trapped in wind. Tiny points of torchlight began to multiply, one after another, moving steadily toward him. All through the thinning night, the plains carried a low, distant rumble that didn't belong to thunder. Jonas recognized it gradually, the way a man remembers an old warning. Drums, steady and deliberate, echoing across open country like a heartbeat meant to be heard by those hiding from it. Each muted thud told him the riders were drawing closer, fanning out to sweep the desert for someone who mattered more than he understood. He stood at the shack's doorway, lantern dimmed, watching the horizon pulse with faint orange glimmers as the drums rose and fell. Whoever saw it, the woman wasn't searching blindly. They were hunting with purpose. Inside, the woman stirred, breath catching against the raw burn of her wound. Jonas knelt beside her, and her eyelids fluttered open, revealing a fever-glazed focus that startled him. "Naira," she breathed, as though offering proof of life. He repeated her name softly, grounding her in the dusty gloom. She clutched his sleeve and forced out a whisper that scraped like sand on stone. "One of ours sold rifles. Army rifles. Said it would end the hunger. But it will start a war." Her throat tightened, and she winced as the pain dragged her backward. "I saw the ledger. He saw me." Jonas felt the A-shift. A betrayal inside her own camp, one worth silencing a healer for. He thought of the drums again, rolling closer, and felt the sharp divide between vengeance and justice tightening like a snare. He didn't know whether these riders wanted to avenge Naira or finish what someone else had started. Either way, they were coming fast. Just before dawn, when shadows still clung to the edges of the world, Jonas stepped out for more firewood, and froze as hooves pounded weakly behind him. His mare staggered into the clearing, reins dragging, sides quivering as though she'd outrun death itself. No rider, no sign of what had happened after she carried Naira into the darkness. Jonas stroked her trembling neck, dread settling heavy in his chest. Something had driven her back. Then the drums cut off. The silence afterward was worse, thick enough to smother breath. Jonas lifted his gaze to the ridge beyond the shack. Against the paling sky, silhouettes multiplied, first a handful, then dozens, until nearly 70 riders lined the crest, still as carved stone. Spears and rifles caught the first spark of sunrise, turning their approach into a slow, deliberate tide. Jonas stood alone in the doorway, knowing dawn had brought far more than light. It had delivered judgment. Who it belonged to, vengeance or justice, remained a breath away. The riders descended the ridge like a slow-moving storm, their horses kicking up pale waves of dust as they surrounded the lined shack in a tightening ring. Jonas stepped forward, palms open, every instinct begging him to step back instead. The warriors halted only a few paces away, their faces set in grim lines, weapons angled with unmistakable intent. At their center rode an elder with silver-streaked braids and eyes carved by years of judgment. His voice carried the weight of final decisions. "You took her," he said. "You carried Naira from the place she fell. You will answer for it." Jonas swallowed hard. Dawn's cold light made every breath visible, every heartbeat louder. He could feel 70 riders waiting for a single word from their elder to seal his fate. Jonas shook his head slowly, careful not to spook the horses or the men holding tight reins. "She was hurt," he said. "I found her near my water barrel. She asked for my horse before she collapsed. I didn't harm her. She's alive inside." A young warrior closest to him scoffed, fury tightening his stance. "A likely lie. Blood for blood." He took a step forward, blade half-drawn. Jonas's pulse thudded painfully in his ears. He reached into his coat with deliberate motion and pulled out the small woven pendant he'd taken earlier to keep safe. The sunbow's threads caught the dawn, glowing briefly like a rising ember. "This was on her," Jonas said. "I know enough to understand what it means." The elder's eyes flickered, but the young warrior snarled. "He stole it from her corpse. He mocks our dead." Jonas held the pendant higher, voice steadying. "She's not dead, and she's no enemy. Someone hurt her, someone who didn't want her speaking." The air thickened as the circle tightened. Spears lowered. Horses pawed the dust. The young warrior, broad-shouldered, jaw set, stepped closer, pointing the blade straight at Jonas's chest. "You will pay for her blood." Before Jonas could answer, the shack door creaked behind him. A figure leaned against the frame, swaying with effort. Naira stepped into the rising light, her skin pale with strain but her eyes sharp with recognition. Gasps rippled through the warriors like wind through tall grass. The elder froze. Jonas turned, instinctively reaching to steady her, but she lifted a hand, motioning him to stay back. Her gaze swept the circle and landed on the young warrior with a look that pierced deeper than any blade. "Tarek," she whispered, voice thin but fierce. "You struck from behind. You took the rifles. You would have blamed the soldiers and lit the whole frontier on fire." A murmur caught fire among the warriors. Tarek stiffened, rage cracking through his composure. "She lies." Pain twists her mind. She wanders from truth. But Naira lifted her pendant. Jonas hadn't realized she wore a second one beneath the torn cloth, and held it high, its threads marked with the healer's sunburst. Jonas lifted the one he held, matching its pattern. Two truths, woven alike. Tarek faltered. Jonas felt 70 sets of eyes shift toward him, heat pressing from all sides. If you were Jonas, with 70 riders demanding blood, what would you do? The elder rode forward, dismounting with the heavy steadiness of a man who had done so many times to face hard reckonings. He took the pendant from Jonas's hand, turned it over, and nodded once. "The mark stands." She speaks with authority. He faced his warriors, voice cutting through the morning like a drawn blade. "Stand down." Spears eased. Tension thinned. Only Tarek remained rigid, breath sharp, eyes darting between Naira and the elder as the truth hemmed him in from every side. And Jonas, exhaling for the first time in what felt like an hour, understood that dawn had chosen its side. Law no longer shielded the guilty, and truth, fragile as it was, had found its voice again. The circle of warriors tightened as the elder stepped aside, giving Naira space she barely had strength to occupy. Dawn pushed a thin band of gold across the dust, catching unlifted spears and the stern faces of men who had ridden through the night believing they were pursuing vengeance. Now they stood in uneasy silence, watching the wounded healer gather her breath. Jonas steadied her with a hand at her elbow, but she straightened on her own, jaw set against the tremor in her frame. "They deserve the truth," she murmured, and he stepped back. Naira raised her voice enough for every rider to hear. "Tarek stole the rifles," she said, each word deliberate. "He meant to trade them to outlaws who would blame your people for the killings. Settlers would answer with force. Blood would cover this land, and none would know he started it." Her accusation struck the warriors like a sudden gust, sending whispers through the ranks. Some stared at Tarek in shock. Others looked sick with recognition as scattered clues fell into place. Tarek barked a bitter laugh, but it rang hollow. "You offer no proof," he spat. "Your wound clouds your mind." Jonas stepped forward, heart thudding. "I found this in her stool bag," he said, pulling from his coat the torn ledger page he'd discovered while searching for bandages the night before. Its edges were frayed, and the ink smudged, but the rows of serial numbers were clear enough. The elder's eyes narrowed as Jonas handed it to him. "It matches the rifles missing from the army outpost," Naira added. He tore the page from the quartermaster's book so no one would trace them. The elder examined the list, expression hardening like drying clay. When he lifted his gaze, it landed on Tarek with a weight no man could outrun. "You would sell our future," he said, voice low. "You would trade our children's safety for silver." Cornered, Tarek's desperation snapped into violence. He lunged at Jonas, blade flashing. Jonas threw himself sideways, boots skidding in the dust. But before Tarek could strike again, 3 warriors seized him, wrenching his arms behind him with brutal efficiency. He snarled, fought, cursed, but the grip of his own people held firm. The elder stepped closer, reclaiming authority once fractured by fear. "Your choices exposed us," he said. "Naira's courage saved us." He turned to Jonas next, and for the first time since dawn, the grim line of his mouth softened. "And this man, who owed us nothing, chose mercy over fear." A ripple moved through the war band, their earlier hostility replaced by something steadier, heavier, respect. Spears lowered in unison. Men who had circled Jonas like wolves now regarded him with nods that carried the gravity of apology. Loyalty to their own had nearly blinded them. Conscience, at last, had guided them back. Jonas released a breath he hadn't noticed he was holding as the warriors led Tarek away to face judgment beneath their law. The desert, moments ago a place of threat, now felt wide with possibility. And in the rising light, he saw clearly what the night had revealed. Mercy had not been a fool's choice, it had been the turning of the whole tide. The elder approached Jonas as the morning settled into quiet, leading a young painted stallion whose coat shimmered with sunrise colors. He placed the reins in Jonas's hands with solemn care, saying the gift honored the horse Jonas had surrendered in mercy and the peace his choice had helped preserve. Jonas bowed his head, feeling the weight of gratitude that needed no further words. When he looked up, Naira met his gaze, strength returning to her eyes, and he knew her people would heal from more than one wound after this day. Months later, at a frontier trading post buzzing with merchants and drifting smoke, Jonas spotted Naira standing near a stall of woven goods. Peace had held. The stolen rifles had been recovered before any outlaw could use them. She pressed the woven pendant into his palm, the threads warm from her touch. A reminder, she said, that mercy carries farther than a horse can run. Jonas closed his fingers around it, understanding the promise woven into its sunburst pattern. Years on, both settlers and Apache spoke of him as the cowboy who saved a healer and helped avert a war. And for those who ride with tales like his, there's always another story waiting just beyond the horizon.